Allen Company, 47 years young and a proud sponsor, wishes OOIDA all the best as you celebrate 50 years.
OOIDA, representing America's truckers since 1973, presents Landline Now with your host, Mark Reddick.
Diesel prices had been on a slow but steady decline in recent months, but not any longer. Tom Kloza of the Oil Price Information Service tells us what's driving prices up and what the tea leaves say about what's coming next. 3 companies have requested an exemption from FMCSA's entry-level driver training rule. Meanwhile, the sponsor of a Senate bill on speed limiters says the FMCSA's efforts on that issue are overreaching and out of touch. I'll get an update on those and more from Colin Long of OOIDA's Washington, D.C. office. And finally, the end of July shipping had a slight impact on the freight market. Landline Now's Ashley Blackford has all the details with DAT coming up in today's market update, including some tips from the FBI Cybercrimes Unit on how owner-operators can stay safe. But first, the news with Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Mark. Our top story today, there's a new effort in Congress to repeal the new entry-level driver training rules that took effect early last year. Representative Bob Good of Virginia reintroduced the Trucking Workforce Improvement Act in July. H.R. 4738 would repeal the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's regulation that requires a prospective driver to complete an entry-level driver training program before receiving a commercial driver's license. It already has 14 co-sponsors. Supporters of the bill say the rule needs to be repealed because they believe there's a shortage of truck drivers, but recent reports have indicated that the opposite is occurring in the industry. In July, NBC News reported that truck drivers were coping with low rates because of overcapacity. OOIDA President Todd Spencer told News Nation around that same time that workers were lured into trucking based on promises from companies and social media influencers promoting the career as a way to get rich quick.
When you talk about driver shortage, that's one of those topics, mythical topics that we've heard about for 3 decades. And it's basically perpetuated by those companies that their real core issue is there are plenty of drivers, they just can't keep them.
Spencer told News Nation that the driver shortage narrative stems from the fact that most truckers are paid by the mile, meaning there are no real financial repercussions for having a large pool of truckers when the economy is down.
From a company perspective, you can never have too many simply because there's no real fixed costs of drivers, since drivers are generally only paid for miles driven, piecework. If you don't have much work for them and they sit around, they may grumble and leave, but as long as you can replace them, you continue operating the same way. And you can be a multi-million mile safe driver, and your pay is going to be the same as the guy that started just last week.
Yeah.
It's a brutal industry on people.
OOIDA opposes repealing the driver training rule. Instead, the association believes the rule should be strengthened. In comments filed last year, OOIDA wrote that there are too many new drivers entering the industry without the basic skills to safely operate a CMV. The association added that while the current entry-level driver training rules are far from sufficient, the regulation does establish minimum qualifications for training instructors, and that if those standards are maintained and enforced, highway safety will undoubtedly improve. Now to an interesting story out of Canada, where a trucking company has been ordered to reinstate a driver who was fired for a DUI-related crash last year. Global News has the report. The initial incident happened on a Pennsylvania roadway last summer. After crashing her truck, the female driver, whose name was not released, told investigators she had consumed at least 9 beers beforehand, then a week later told her trucking company that she was an alcoholic. Nobody was hurt in the crash, although the truck was damaged. Instead of firing her, which they did, she argued that her company, Group Robert, could have installed a breathalyzer in her truck following the crash, or found another position within the company for her. The case went into arbitration. Fast forward to this week when the arbitrator ruled in favor of the trucker, citing alcoholism as a disability. The arbitrator said the company should have made accommodations for her. They then ordered that Group Robert give her job back. Even though the driver was awarded that job back because the crash happened in the U.S., she is subject to U.S. drug and alcohol testing regulations. That means before she can drive, she will have to complete a return-to-duty process. You've probably noticed diesel prices creeping up again. We told you earlier this week about a roughly 19-cent jump on the weekly EIA report. ProMiles.com has that average up more than 21 cents today compared to last Wednesday. But Tom Kloza of the Oil Price Information Service says he's not surprised. There's a number of factors pushing up prices right now.
Well, I think two things. Number one was the price of crude oil. The Saudis extended their cuts of 1 million barrels a day through August, and they're probably going to extend it through September as well. And some of the other OPEC countries appear to have cut. And then Russia, of all things, is not exporting as much as they'd like to. So that's tightened up oil to where there's probably about 2 million barrels a day more demand than there is supply in the third quarter. That'll change.
As for how high we'll go before things start to come down again, Tom has some thoughts. He'll give those to you a little later on in our program. Teamsters members at T-Force Freight are officially working under a new 5-year contract. The nearly 8,000 Teamsters working for the LTL carrier ratified the deal on Tuesday with an 81% majority. The new agreement, which runs through July 2028, includes wage increases, certain protections against subcontracting and technology, and for T-Force to increase health, welfare, and pension plan contributions. Schneider is expanding by way of another acquisition. This time, it's Massachusetts-based M&M Transport that's being acquired. The deal includes M&M's 500 trucks and 1,900 trailers and access to its 12 locations, which mostly service the Northeast, Midwest, and Southwest regions. Terms of the deal were not announced. Schneider says M&M will operate as one of its subsidiaries. Kentucky State Police are out there as we speak, taking part in a 3-day enforcement blitz. It's called Operation Safe Drive. The high-visibility campaign is aimed at reducing crashes involving commercial vehicles. To accomplish that goal, Kentucky State troopers are stepping up inspections at scale facilities. A news release says they'll be making sure drivers are following safety regulations, including hours of service compliance. Kentucky State Police will also be looking out for dangerous driving behaviors among all road users, such as tailgating, distracted driving, and failure to wear a seatbelt. A new survey is naming and shaming the states with the most distracted drivers. Insurance company Assurance says half of respondents in Mississippi and New Hampshire admitted to texting and driving in the last month. That's the highest rate in the nation. Missouri came in third at 49%. On the other side of the spectrum, New York had the lowest rate of people who texted while driving at just under 15%, followed by Pennsylvania and Oregon. In total, 37% of U.S. drivers admitted to texting while driving in the past month, but the survey also took other distractions into account. Assurance said more than 2/3 of Americans admitted to selecting music while driving, 56% admitted to checking the GPS, about 55% to interacting with adults in the car, and about 37% to eating food while driving. And finally, nominations for the Women in Trucking Association's annual Influential Woman in Trucking Award are now open. Since 2010, the association has been honoring women in the transportation industry who make or influence key decisions in settings ranging from the corporate level and manufacturing to owner-operators and other drivers. Trina Norman, the Southern California feeder operations manager for UPS, won last year. Nominations for this year's award will be accepted through September 11th. The winner will be announced in November at the WIT Accelerate Conference and Expo in Dallas. That's Landline Now News for today. I'm Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Scott. You can support the OOIDA Mary Johnston Scholarship by sending tax-deductible donations to OOIDA Foundation, Inc., 1 Northwest OOIDA Drive, Grain Valley, Missouri, 64029. Next, Tom Kloza of the Oil Price Information Service tells us what's driving diesel prices up. We'll be back in just a moment with more of the program. I'm Mark Reddick, and this is Landline Now.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
For can't miss accuracy, weigh your truck on a CAT scale.
When you weigh on a CAT scale, you get a no excuses guarantee. You can now save time weighing by using your smartphone. Find out more at weightmytruck.com.
Since you started, what you've loved about trucking is the freedom. Heading out on your favorite route, a good driving song, and thinking about truck insurance. Well, maybe not that last one. That's why we're here. At OOIDA, we have a full range of truck insurance products, expert advice, and great customer service, helping you get the right coverage for your operation. Go to OOIDA.com because your job is to drive. Our job is to help with everything else.
And just like that, diesel prices appear to be back on the rise again. To put things into perspective and tell us what the tea leaves might be telling us, we are joined by Tom Kloza. Tom is a global head of energy analysis for the Oil Price Information Service. Tom, always good to talk to you. How you doing?
Hi, nice to be here.
So we had been seeing this slow but steady decline in diesel prices over the past several months or so. Then just over the past week or two, they've shot back up. I think we're looking at more than $4 a gallon now, pretty much on every metric out there. Let's start there with the recent rise with a simple question. What's behind the spike?
Well, I think two things. Number one was the price of crude oil. The Saudis extended their cuts of 1 million barrels a day through August, and they're probably going to extend it through September as well. And some of the other OPEC countries appear to have cut. And then Russia, of all things, is not exporting as much as they'd like to. So that's tightened up oil to where there's probably about 2 million barrels a day more demand than there is supply in the third quarter. That'll change. So that's lifted prices by about $12 or $13 for crude, which transfers to about 25 or 30 cents. And then U.S. refineries have had some issues with hot weather. They haven't been able to run probably about 700,000 barrels a day of capacity, mostly at the Gulf Coast. And so the wholesale prices are up about 60 cents from July 3rd, and you're starting to see that on the street now.
You got a few things there. I'm going to follow up with you here over the course of the next several minutes. I want to start with one thing you mentioned there, and we've been talking about Russia now for, I guess about a year and a half since they invaded Ukraine. How much a weight is that pulling down right now on the markets? That still, it sounds like a pretty big concern out there.
Yeah, I think the OPEC Plus cuts were anticipated, and Russia, will give lip service to the fact that they're going to cut, but they haven't been necessarily honest about it. But for one reason or another, they're down about 500,000 barrels a day on crude. All their diesel and their other products are getting to markets, but they're tending to go to Asia. So that's tightened it up. And like I said, the third quarter is a high demand point. World demand is the highest it's ever been, probably 102, 103 million barrels a day. And I think supply will loosen up later in the year, but for this month and into September, it's pretty tight.
Yeah, so clearly a supply-demand issue right now. You mentioned the weather as well. We've obviously had a brutal summer so far, and I think we're only, about halfway through at this point. What effect exactly has that been having on the markets? We're also, of course, I think entering hurricane season. The refineries especially, are they in decent shape right now? Are we kind of bracing for impact here as the weeks and months come to us?
Well, the intense heat has mostly been in Texas, Louisiana, Tennessee, places like that. And think about refineries the way you might think about a pitcher in baseball. That they're not going to be able to go 100 pitches when it's 100 degrees outside. And these refineries were built for heat, but they weren't built for heat of around 100 degrees for 15 days. The good news is that should break this month. The bad news is the Gulf of Mexico is about 92 degrees Fahrenheit for the water temperature, and that means that anything that develops in the Gulf of Mexico can really knock out a lot of refined capacity. I'm guessing that some of the market's rise of about 60 cents is tied to the expectation that there'll be some interruptions at the Gulf of Mexico. But hopefully we'll be free and clear from it, because every hurricane destroys demand. It's the rare hurricane like Katrina and Rita and Ida, that destroy a lot of supply, and hopefully that won't happen.
Yeah. In the short term here, you talk about all these factors that are swirling around out there. In the short term, as I said at the start here, we have seen prices go up over the past couple of weeks quite a bit after being used to them going down slow but steadily over the past several months. In the short term here, when we look at all these factors that are out there with the OPEC cuts and demand being what it is right now. Are we going to see prices over the next several weeks go up and then maybe hopefully come down a little bit as we enter fall, or what does the forecast kind of tell you right now?
I think, it's very typical to get a preseason rally for diesel. The one thing I would stress is that this whole rally has not been about demand. It's been about supply and supply constraints. So, demand, I think we're still in a freight recession. I think demand is still deteriorated versus where it was last year. And if we have any more days in the stock market where it's down 2 or 3% like today, that could deteriorate a little bit more. So I think there's a bit of a honeymoon period where if we get into the middle of September and we don't have a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, I think prices will give something back. But I don't think they're going to go back to where they were in June, where, largely we had a lot of places where it was about $3.75 to $3.85 for diesel. I think there'll be too many people betting on the chance that we will have a winter. And remember, the diesel molecule and the heating oil molecule are very similar. And that means that it'll go to heat homes in the Northeast or homes in Europe.
Yeah, I mentioned the forecasts there and predictions, and that's exactly what they are, right? They're forecasts and predictions. We don't know what's to come here in terms of hurricanes or heat or what have you. Could be Russia or OPEC. I did check before we started talking here because my memory was foggy on what the predictions said about fuel prices by the end of 2023. I looked it up here, and most of them, I think, were expecting prices over $4 even by the end of this year. I think EIA had their forecast at something like $4.50 a gallon. It seemed like we were on track there, dipping below $4 a gallon, as you mentioned. But maybe those predictions were actually right. I mean, are we going to creep up, do you think, to that $4.50 range by the end of this year and the holidays?
Yeah, I think we're probably within about 20 cents of where we'll move. And then if you have a normal winter, maybe we'll see prices around $4.25. If you have a cold winter, it could be maybe not exponentially higher, but considerably higher. But we all have to pay attention to the economic lessons here. We're starting to get a little damage, and there's a tradition in August and September where economies slow down, and that could really have some ramifications because there's one thing about industrial slowdowns. It really impacts diesel fuel. And, it's been kind of a torpor for diesel fuel for most of the year. Like I said, this is all about supply and not about demand.
Yeah, you and I talked during the pandemic more than a few times about the situation out there and how just crazy weird it was. I'm wondering now that we are kind of, at least not in a pandemic and kind of at a historical, normal point, I guess we could say. Are there any historical comparisons to what we're seeing now? I imagine there have been in recent history, and you've obviously been around for quite a few of these cycles here. Anything compared to the past that you're seeing right now?
No, I think, we need to pay attention to it because last year everyone kind of collectively lost their heads and they thought that the Russian molecules weren't going to get to market. And that was really why we saw $5 and $6 pricing points. I would argue, and even Goldman Sachs argues, that it's really hard to get back to $100 a barrel for crude. There's just too much easy crude in Texas and New Mexico and Guyana and Brazil, so that it would take something extraordinary to bring about those numbers. So I would tell people to rest easy that you're not going to see numbers like you saw in 2022. But maybe what we saw in June was about as good as it gets until we get into the middle of 2024. Next year, by all means, should be a cheaper year for crude oil because there's a lot of new crude that's coming on.
Yeah, which again, I think is something that a lot of the forecasts had said as well here at the start of the year. Gas prices, I want to ask you about that real quick here in terms of where they stand. Obviously not raising at the same rate that diesel is, and you kind of talked about the reasons why there. But where are we headed with gas prices?
I think we're close to a plateau now. We've gone from about $3.50 to $3.80. We topped $3.80 last night, and I think the $3.80, $3.83 numbers are about as high as we get. You know, I said earlier this year that I thought we'd see gas prices that are like major league leading batting averages, and I don't think we're going to get to Ted Williams, you know, 406
Okay.
or some of those numbers. So we're in Tony Gwynn territory, but I think that's as bad as it gets. And the components that you manufacture gasoline with get really cheap here in about a few weeks. So I think whatever you see now will be much, much cheaper October, November, December.
Tony Gwynn, George Brett level, under $4 a gallon, under 400. It sounds like
That's
there.
it. Well, George Brett was $3.90.
Yeah,
so I
yep.
think, and Gwynn was up there as well, and maybe, but I think it might take a hurricane to get to those numbers.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? That, you know, we say all of these things with some caution because we don't know what's going to happen, and nobody does. Nobody has a crystal ball. But there are so many different factors out there right now that could have a negative effect on you know, supply and by extension demand as well. And that's the uncertainty here that kind of factors in with all of these, right?
It is, but, you know, the probability is that we won't get a hurricane impact from Corpus Christi to Pascagoula. So, you know, the luck of the Irish is on our side. And, you know, spending most of my year in Fort Myers, I hope we don't get anything in the Gulf of Mexico.
I hear that. I'll second that as well. Hey, Tom, we learn something new every time we talk to you. I did want to ask you one thing, and I think I've asked you this before at the end of our conversations, because as I mentioned there, you have been doing this for a while, and you have a lot of perspective and insights as to what's going on and what might be going on as well. Anything out there maybe, you know, surprise you, or something you think might surprise us about what you're seeing out there, or, you know, maybe it's a concern or something along those lines? Anything that jumps out to you?
Well, you know, the thing that jumps out at me, and this actually happened today, is that the United States we're not just the largest exporter of crude oil and refined products. We're leaving everybody else in our wake. This morning, the numbers show that we exported 11.8 million barrels a day of crude oil and refined products. And, you know, that's a great thing for the balance of trade, but it also means that if you get a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, it doesn't just have domestic consequences. It has consequences internationally, because we've become kind of like the Saudi Arabia and Russia, almost combined, of crude oil and refined products exports. It's not so much about our demand, it's about what we supply to the rest of the world and tilt the balances for the rest of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, one domino falling there could have consequences on down the line. It's interesting you say that, because I think that perception is not, you know, what you said there is not what people's perceptions are about the current state of things, which I think is interesting.
No, I think if you ask most people who are the largest exporters of crude and products in the world, they'll say Saudi Arabia and Russia. But the United States has left those in their wake. I mean, 11.8 million barrels a day. You know, the Saudis are only producing about 9 million barrels a day, lower than that because of the cuts. So it's all about the United States. And it's not just crude oil. It's propane and petrochemicals and all sorts of things. Real good balance of trade, really busy in Corpus Christi and Houston.
There you go. As I said there, Tom, we learn something new every time we talk to you, and we appreciate you putting all of this into perspective, because it is complicated, a lot of moving parts, but you always help us understand it better, so we appreciate it.
No problem.
Our thanks to Tom Kloza of the Oil Price Information Service. You can check them out at opis.net. We've got a break coming up fast, but stick around. There's more Landline Now right around the corner.
You trust PrePass for more bypasses? Now let PrePass help with tolls. PrePass toll service means lower cost, one invoice for all tolls, and fewer violations. Created by truckers for truckers. Call 877-878-5970 or go to prepass.com.
Attention all truckers, Dean Michael, the tax doctor here. I want to talk to you about those dreaded tax problems. I know you want to keep on trucking and not even think about them, but let's face it, they're not going away all on their own. You need professional help. I've been helping truckers put their tax problems in the rearview mirror for years. I can help you too. Call me now for a free consultation at 888-557-4020 or go to mytaxhelpmd.com. It's like I always say, keep your eyes on the road, I'll keep mine on the IRS. 888-557-4020.
Three companies have requested an exemption from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's entry-level driver training rule. You're listening to Landline Now, and this is Regulatory Roundup. I'm Mark Reddig, and I'm joined today by Colin Long of OOIDA's Washington, D.C. office. Colin, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Glad to be filling in for my coworker Jay. I hope to do justice to his regulatory roundup every week, but I know it's going to be difficult.
Well, let's start with who it is that's asking for these exemptions. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, like you said in your intro, we're talking about three motor carriers who are looking to get an exemption from FMCSA on the ELDT requirements that went into place recently. The names of those carriers are Mills Transfer, Heartland Express, and Contract Freighters Incorporated. And basically, what they're attempting to do is get permission from the agency to allow them to use driving instructors that only have 1 year of experience behind the wheel, rather than reaching the requirement in ELDT that says that these instructors must have 2 years under their belt of driving experience.
So why are they saying that they need this particular exemption?
Well, they're saying they struggle to find enough instructors with 2 years of experience to meet the type of demand they're seeing from folks who want to gain their commercial driver's license. So basically, they're saying there's too many folks that they could offer opportunities to get their CDLs for the number of instructors who meet the requirements under ELDT. And I think, we as an organization have been strong supporters of ELDT. In fact, we think some of the requirements should go further, not necessarily this specific requirement that trainers have 2 years of experience, but we think any sort of efforts to deteriorate or decrease those requirements are taking us in the wrong direction. And in fact, we should be going the opposite way. We should be strengthening a lot of these requirements.
Let's talk a little bit about the regulation itself here, Colin. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what the rule calls for. Obviously, it's got this 2-year requirement on training instructors, but what else does it call for?
I get frustrated with this because, we had pushed for this to include some mandatory behind-the-wheel training, which I think seems like it would be a pretty straightforward solution to improving safety. That was omitted. So really, we're looking at kind of a watered-down training regimen anyway, which requires hours of education, knowledge testing, and whatnot. All in all, I think these are really minimum requirements. We shouldn't forget that. They're kind of what we view as a starting point to build upon to make requirements even more robust, because that's the best way to promote highway safety in the views of OOIDA. So we don't think a lot of the concerns that we've heard, and I shouldn't say, let me go back and say not a lot of the concerns, because we haven't heard a lot of concerns, but we've certainly heard heartburn coming through Capitol Hill with some of these requirements. Folks think that they are costly, they are burdensome. A lot of those concerns were being voiced early in the implementation of the ELD requirement, which, lest we forget, was delayed for 2 years. So folks had an extra 2 years to come into compliance. And a lot of the concerns we've heard over the implementation period now have kind of deteriorated, and we kind of anticipated that happening. We told folks on Capitol Hill, there's going to be a learning curve. Folks are going to have to get accustomed to these requirements, which aren't that extensive. And once they do, I think we'll start hearing less and less about problems folks are encountering, whether it be cost or burden. And that has really happened. We really have seen the concerns being voiced here in Washington diminish over time as people became more comfortable and I think realized that these are not extensive requirements. They're actually pretty much a slight improvement over what the norm is. And I think it's concerning to us at OOIDA to see now that folks are saying this 2-year requirement for trainers is too extensive, because I don't think anyone currently on the road is going to think, well, a year behind the wheel is sufficient for training the new candidates coming in as potential long-haul drivers. I don't think our members are really going to take that position. So, unfortunately, I think we look at this exemption request and think this is probably going to be something we oppose, simply because we don't want to see this rule start to be deteriorated, because we know there are other folks out there who want to attack certain provisions within the rule because it will make their lives easier and, frankly, cheaper.
Well, you mentioned they think there are too few instructors at the 2-year level. They want to use the 1-year level, and at the same time, they've got too many people wanting to get their CDLs. Doesn't this really kind of make the case for the fact that this is a turnover problem in trucking rather than a shortage problem?
Yeah, I think you're onto something, Mark. And it really does. I mean, we've been saying for years, like, careful how you talk about a driver shortage, because we believe firmly that it's actually a retention and turnover problem. Yet we still have folks in our industry coming out and basically saying, well, we want changes to rules and to policies, because the point you're making right now, like, it's abundantly clear that the industry is incapable of keeping new drivers very long. I mean, they want to go to a single year of experience to train folks entering the industry as new drivers. Well, how is there a lack of drivers with 2-year experience who want to go into the training field? And you're right. I think you're absolutely right. It's indicative of the fact that the industry has become, or I should say, turnover has become so prevalent in the industry that folks are struggling to find trainers, potential trainers, with a minimum of 2 years experience. I think it's kind of shocking. And I think a lot of our members who have years and years and years of experience would kind of look at this and think, folks with 2 years experience, that's a bare minimum. So going down to 1 is really quite frightening. I mean, we hear from members all the time, the biggest problems with highway safety are drivers aren't being trained properly to adjust to their conditions, to recognize potential hazards, to drive in different terrains and different weather conditions. And I think a lot of that goes back to the fact that they're not receiving the type of training they should. So when you start trying to deteriorate or provide exemptions from what we view as kind of a watered-down, bare minimum training regimen, we're going to have issues with that.
Well, we'll see what goes on that going forward. In the meanwhile, let's move to another topic here. That is Senator Steve Daines of Montana, who has characterized the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's efforts to mandate speed limiters on commercial motor vehicles as overreaching and out of touch. So I guess it's clear where the senator stands. But before we get into that, I'm wondering if you can review what we know at this point about the speed limiter proposed rulemaking. I mean, what are we expecting? What's still up in the air?
Yeah, we're still in somewhat of limbo, and this is why we're pursuing solutions on Capitol Hill, because we're waiting on the agency to move forward with a proposed rulemaking. And I think one of the key elements we're still waiting to find out is, what speed are they going to set as a maximum for every truck on the road? And if you remember, they're debating between 60, 65, and 68. And we think 60 is just preposterous. So in the meantime, we as an organization are leading a coalition of other industries who will be affected by this to pursue legislation to basically tell the agency enough is enough. I mean, we think the agency has gone too far with its own authority in pushing for this mandate. They weren't required to do so by Congress. And now, unfortunately, as a last resort, the only way we can stop it is to have a legislative solution, which has been introduced in the House and is now introduced in the Senate. But until those measures are passed into law, the agency can continue to move forward with the speed limiter rulemaking, which they intend to do. Now, they've been delayed in their process, likely because they received over 15,000 comments from the initial public comment period, primarily from drivers saying, do not impose a speed limiter mandate on us. It takes away operational control of the vehicles. It makes our lives and the lives around us less safe because it'll increase crash rates. And it's also bad for driver retention and recruitment to pursue a rulemaking that drivers say they hate. So The problem is FMCSA has made it crystal clear that they intend to move forward on this rulemaking, and they have the support of safety advocacy groups who want to go as low as 60 miles per hour. They have the support of large motor carriers who want to use this as an economic weapon to slow down their smaller competitors and pick up their loads. And unfortunately, we have to pursue this on Capitol Hill simply because the agency has kind of turned a blind eye to the number of truckers who are voicing opposition and continue to move forward with the rulemaking.
I'm kind of curious. You mentioned earlier that this is not something they were called on to do by Congress. And we tell people all the time that Congress is where this type of activity starts when they call for agencies to do that. What is their authority then for introducing this measure if it hasn't been called on by Congress?
The departments and agencies all get their authority to do things like this from Congress, and it's Congress's responsibility to kind of rein them in when they've gone too far. And I think this is a great example. And we say they're going too far because not only is it bad for safety, it's bad for retention, it's bad for recruitment, it's going to slow down the supply chain, and drivers oppose it. So really, we think they've gone several steps too far in pursuing this, but that's where Congress has to come in. I mean, don't forget, Congress recently passed a highway bill, the IIJA, a couple of years ago, which is hard to believe right now. But in that bill, there was no requirement for FMCSA to move forward on a speed limiter mandate. There wasn't even a requirement included in the House Democrats' version of that bill that they introduced when they were in charge. And the reason for that is because I think they probably knew a lot of these concerns were valid. I mean, you're going to slow down the supply chain when it's still currently on the ropes. You're going to worsen driver retention and recruitment when there's folks out there saying they can't get trainers with 2 years of experience. You're going to overrule the objections of 15,000 drivers who said, please do not move forward with this rulemaking. And I think it's a demonstration that FMCSA has just gone too far with its own authority on some of these rulemakings. And really, Congress needs to now come in and say, hey, we never told you to do this. In fact, we don't think you should be doing it, so please stop.
Well, at the same time, we've got this Senate bill. We also already have a bill in the House. Tell us a little bit about that measure.
It's pretty straightforward. I mean, it says FMCSA, knock it off. No more rulemaking on speed limiters, and we're gaining co-sponsors. In fact, we're going to be adding another one this week. We continue to do that by, making these arguments to lawmakers, which we think are very valid and reasonable, and doing so with a coalition of industry groups that support us on this, including agriculture, livestock, materials, the towing industry. I mean, speed limiter mandate has brought the towing industry and OOIDA closer together on an issue than I think we ever have been. That's indicative of what type of opposition this has within our broader industry because of the effects it's going to have on anyone who's involved in the trucking industry. So we're glad that House bill is gaining momentum, gaining co-sponsors, especially members of the House Transportation Committee. And we think having the introduction of a Senate bill with some really pragmatic senators on board is going to help us bring more members on board in the House and grow the co-sponsors in the Senate. I think we're really well positioned to make a lot of noise about this rulemaking. And I'm going to be frank. I mean, it's going to be difficult to get these provisions signed into law, especially under a Biden White House and with Democrats controlling the Senate. But raising the issue is certainly going to enhance the arguments we make. I mean, since these bills were introduced, we've had new organizations join our coalition to fight against it. And I think there's no going back from that point. It's only going to continue to grow. Our arguments are only going to be amplified on Capitol Hill, and it's only going to put more pressure on the agency who is moving forward with what we think is, quite frankly, a reckless rulemaking, no matter what speed they determine to use. So these bills are going to remain relevant for quite a while, and I think in the meantime we start to gain more co-sponsors. We start to put more pressure on leaders in the House and the Senate to address this issue because hopefully at some point the calls to end this rulemaking will be overwhelming and unavoidable.
Well, Colin, we've run out of time, but thank you very much for the information.
Thanks for having me. I hope it did Jay justice today.
Landline Now will be back in just a moment.
Firestone tires are for more of everything. more miles for every tire dollar, and more confidence in your fleet. At Firestone, we help fleets save with dependable value. Find your local Firestone dealer today at firestonetire.com/dealer.
Ready to make more money? Use a better load board. For a limited time, get 50% off Truckstop Load Board Pro. Just go to truckstop.com/go and enter promo code READY2023 when you purchase Load Board Pro.
It's tested and proven. Burn 2.1% less fuel when you balance all wheel ends with Centromatic. Call 800-523-8473 to get the OOIDA discount.
Landline Now. Welcome back. There are a number of critical questions you need to answer in order to run a successful trucking business. Among the most important of those questions are, where's the freight going to be and how much is it going to pay? Today, Landline Now senior correspondent Ashley Blackford will bring us answers to both of those important questions with a look at this week's freight markets with the folks from DAT. Here's Ashley now with the report.
Thanks, Mark, and hello once again to Robert Rouse with DAT. How are you doing today, Robert?
I'm doing great, Ashley. Thanks for asking.
Now, we're into a new month. Did the end-of-month shipping have any impact on the spot market last week?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely did see a slight bump in the freight market as shippers were trying to move their goods at the end of the month. Last week, we saw about a 4.3% increase in load volumes, up to 1.325 million loads. To put that into some context and perspective, that is almost identical amount of loads that we saw this time in 2019. And in 2019, we also saw a slight bump as we moved into August as well. So hoping that that trend continues this year as well. When we look at the number of trucks on the DAT load board last week, we did see a pretty good decrease in those, down 8.5%. Down to 360,000 trucks. That's still very strong for the truck market, but definitely something that we're watching as well. While loads increased, trucks posted on the DAT load board decreased over last week, and we saw the load-to-truck ratios increase actually across all equipment types. For example, reefer spot market volumes improved slightly last week, and it was boosted by an 8% week-over-week increase in produce truckload volumes in California. It's the largest produce state in the nation with around 30% of market share of the entire country, which is actually pretty huge. Arizona coming in very close behind them. Load post increased by about 5% week over week, while carrier equipment post decreased by about 10%. And that resulted in last week's load to truck ratio increasing slightly from 3.57 to 4.14. The load to truck ratios are still trending at the same levels we saw in 2019. When we look at those trend lines, they are almost right on top of each other. So, more indication of what's going on there. And kind of to understand how all of that impacts the rates, when we look at the national broker to carrier spot rates for dry vans actually decreased last week, and reefers and flatbeds stayed relatively stable. So for dry vans, even though we saw an increase in load volume last week, capacity continued to loosen following a 2 cent per mile decrease in the dry van line haul rates. At $2.08 per mile, the national average is about 31 cents per mile lower than in 2022, but it's still about 10 cents higher per mile than it was in 2019. But without fuel, came in right around $1.64. Reefer line haul rates were pretty flat last week, with the national average remaining around $2.45 per mile. Reefer spot rates are about 30 cents per mile lower than 2022 and only 13 cents per mile higher than 2019. And then lastly, for flatbeds, after dropping about 6 cents per mile in the last 4 weeks, flatbed rates went against the trend and actually increased by just a penny from the previous week. So not much change in either of those.
Since we're in the middle of the dog days of summer, what markets should van carriers be looking at this week?
Yeah, absolutely. Several years ago, I went and visited some companies out in Memphis, Tennessee. And the thing that struck me about the city was there are a few malls and different facilities that had been shut down. But with such a central location in the country, it seemed like a land of opportunity for the logistics space. We're starting to see that might be coming to fruition. Memphis has long been a super regional logistics hub. I-40 runs coast to coast. I-55 intersects Memphis and allows direct access from Chicago down to Louisiana. I-69 puts Memphis on the road from Canada to Mexico. Trucks leaving Memphis can reach about 35% of the total U.S. population overnight. And lastly, I think most drivers may already know this, but Memphis has the headquarters of FedEx, and they have a very large presence in the area with a large amount of their air freight coming in through that hub. So when we look at Memphis overall, the Memphis market has added 8.8 million square feet of warehouse space in 2022 alone, including new facilities occupied by Associated Wholesale Grocers, Saks Fifth Avenue, and Wheeler Freight Solutions. And nearly 8 million square feet of space is currently under construction, and most of which is scheduled to be delivered in 2023. So it's really starting to ramp up and be a hub for the majority of the country.
Now, earlier this week, DAT held a webinar panel with a member of the FBI Cyber Crimes Unit. What tips were discussed that owner-operators can take advantage of?
Yeah, at DAT, we're very passionate about doing what we can to help owner-operators combat multiple types of fraud in our industry. As you said, we had a webinar with an FBI agent that gave a lot of great information on the increase in cyber crimes and how to combat it. One takeaway was that threat actors like to find target-rich areas that have lots of transactions happening all day. When you look at the spot market, that's exactly what you get with brokers and carriers completing thousands of transactions every day, meaning there's lots of opportunity to get in the middle of those transactions. They spent most of the webinar talking about two major attack methods from a cyber perspective, which is ransomware and business email compromises. The main thing I think owner-operators would take away from it was how to defend against business email compromises. That's a very common attack. Most of these attacks actually focus on social engineering. This is where the attacker looks for common things about a person's online presence and uses that information to make it look more legit. In the past, these attacks might have been easy to spot because of spelling or other grammatical errors. But the FBI said that this is not what they have been seeing recently. The attackers are simply hoping to overload and hope that they catch a couple people slipping up when they're tired or not focused. So that's really what they're trying to do. The best defense for email or text message compromises are to be very aware of what you post online and ensure that communications are coming from the right email address or text message. Attackers may change a letter or two of an email address and hope that you don't catch it. The last thing for owner-operators to know is how important it is to report cyber crimes. If you have been a victim of any of these types of cyber crimes, they definitely urge everybody to go to ic3.gov, so IndiaCharlie3.gov. And you can report any cyber crimes directly to that unit, and they will be able to see what they can do to help you out. Definitely encourage you get all the owner operators to do that. But at DAT, we've created a network integrity unit with over 30 years of experience protecting the network. So DAT's network integrity unit expertly governs North America's largest on-demand freight network, ensuring a secure and trusted platform to conduct business. And they oversee network governance, cybersecurity, vetting of our user accounts, fraud detection and prevention, and resolve all reports of bad behavior in the network. That team has been recognized multiple times by law enforcement. The NIU really plays a crucial role in dismantling cargo fraud operations that has happened over the past several years. DAT has invested in fraud prevention, expanding the NIU by over 150% in the past 2 years to combat the rise in fraud in our industry. And they investigate and resolve 100% of bad actor claims, and has now turned its focus to deploying more sophisticated data science techniques to deploy fraud models across the entire ecosystem to detect and stop fraud before it even happens. And, we're working with other industry partners, associations, and law enforcement agencies such as the FBI to coordinate efforts to identify and block bad actors from operating in the transportation industry and get the permanent removal of known bad freight actors when they're caught.
All right, Robert, thank you so much.
Appreciate it, Ashley.
That was Robert Grouse with DAT. Mark, back to you.
Thanks, Ashley. That's our program for today. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Mark Reddig, and this is Landline Now.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
I'm a dad,
a son,
a husband,
wife,
I'm a writer,
photographer.
I farm.
I'm a veteran.
I love old cars, fishing,
my kids,
Chrome, and I am
a professional truck driver.
And together we are OOIDA.
OOIDA was founded by truckers to stand up and speak on behalf of truckers. We've done that by combining the individual voices of our members into a single, powerful voice. Protecting your interests, defending your rights.
Join us! Make your voice heard. Join OOIDA, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. Call 1-800-444-5791 or visit ooida.com.